Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the YouTube channel grecochess, the channel of the game of chess. In this video, from Parsippany, New Jersey, the USATE Championship, the United States Amateur Team East Championship, that takes place, and we don't have players competing with each other, but teams. And I'm a member of a team that I'm going to share with you. It is called the Gov't Closed Opening with Brian Lawson, Alan Cantor, Jay Kleinman, and myself being the 4 participants, the 4 members of the team, and I'm board number 4. And I'm going to show you something now. The wonderful t-shirt of the team. The Gov't Closed Opening. This is the t-shirt that we are wearing. Let's see if I can show it better. Here we are. In the first round, a few more details about the tournament. It has to do with the rules. First of all, it is 6 rounds that take place, 2 on Saturday. The first video was from the 1 p.m. on Saturday. This video is about the 7:30 p.m. on Saturday. 2 more rounds, Sunday, 11 a.m., 6 p.m., and 2 more on Monday, 9 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. Time control, 40 moves in 30 minutes, and sudden death, 30 minutes. Sudden death is nothing so scary as it sounds. It means that once players exhaust their 100 minutes, assuming they have played at least 40 moves, they have 30 moves, 30 remaining minutes for the remaining of the game. Of course, if they completed their 40 moves in less than 100 minutes, the remaining time is also added to the 30 minutes. A 5-second delay means that for any move, whether in the first 40 or later, when it's your time to play, for the first 5 seconds, the clock does not move, and then it continues going downwards. Round number 1, if you see the previous video, I started with a loss, and unfortunately, a team lost to a team called the 4 nights no sleep. Round number 2 now. I'll go to the chess analysis board. You may wonder who was my opponent, and my opponent requested I do not share identity, and I'm not going to do so. I'm going to reveal neither my opponent's identity nor their teams. This individual will only be identified as my opponent. But my opponent had the rating much lower than mine, which made me the clear favorite. And my opponent had the white pieces, I had the black, and we're going to go through the game. The computer is going to make comments on every move. The first few moves are usually the book moves, meaning following opening theory, and then can put anything from 2 exclamation points that is brilliant, 1 exclamation point means the greats, a star means the best. If it puts a thumbs up, it's great, so means excellent, sorry, and if it puts a check mark, it is good. Question mark with exclamation point means inaccuracy. Question mark is mistake, and 2 question marks are blunder. Computer will show which move would have been the best the player should have played, especially if they played something else, and what are the top options for the other player whose turn is to come. And we're starting. My opponent starts with a pawn to e4. That is the most popular move for white. They may also place their pawn on d4, or even their pawn on c4, the English opening, or sometimes the knight on f3, or even the bishop on g3. These are the most popular, I would say the best moves. If you want a slightly inferior move to surprise your opponent, you may place the knight to b3, excuse me, the pawn to b3 or the knight to c3. Or sometimes the pawns go to d3 or e3. When white plays pawn to e4, the most popular option for black is the Sicilian defense, pawn to c5, followed by the symmetric pawn to e5. I played the third best pawn to d6, but they may even play the Alekhine defense, knight to f6, and some other pawns like the modern defense, pawn to g6, and so on. I play the French not because it's really better, because that's what I know the best. There's also the Pirc opening, pawn goes to d6. I forgot to tell you one of the other options. Second move, pawn to d4. This usually, if we start with the French, the normal variation it's called is pawn goes to d4. And in this case, I place the pawn to d5 because I already considered a little bit of space. Let's not concede more of the space. No, white has at least three options. In fact, more than a lot. Let's count them. Knight can go to either c3 or d2, two options. Pawn can go to e5 or take here, or bishop goes to d3. You see, already five options are more or less the best. They have a very small difference in percentages, but the game usually is not decided by what opening you choose, so long as it's a bona fide opening, a regular opening. Knight goes to d2, that's what I chose. And for me, it's very tempting to place my knight on c6 and attack the pawn on d4. But if I do so and my opponent defends, for example, the pawn to c3, then my c pawn is blocked behind the knight. That's why I decided to place my pawn to c5, which the computer before said is the best. My opponent decides to take on d5, and now I must take back if I don't want to be behind material. Three ways to take back. Pawn goes to d4. But if I do so, I allow my opponent to take on e6. And then if I take, questions how to take back. Don't want to take the pawn because I'm opening the diagonal from h5 to d8. I have to take with the bishop here. I don't feel very comfortable. Sorry, that was a mistake. Let's delete this move. The other option to take is the d5 pawn, which I preferred, but how to take it? If I take it with the e6 pawn, which computer thinks the best, opponent will take c5. Let's see what happens. Opponent takes it, I take it, bishop takes it, and you see what's happening. My opponent d5 is isolated. No pawns on the c and e file, and isolated pawns, usually you don't want to have them. Because then your opponent is going to attack the pawn, and you must use your pieces to defend the pawn. Either you have to give away on the pawn, or if you use your pieces, assume you have enough pieces to do so, then the pieces cannot be active elsewhere. So you may lose either a wonderful attacking opportunity or weaken your defense elsewhere. That's why I decided to take it to the queen. And there is no knight to be placed on c3 to attack my queen. And my opponent decided to take the pawn on c5 with the pawn. Otherwise, they could be in danger of losing it. And I take it back with my bishop. It's wonderful. I have two of my pieces in the center of the board, but especially the queen cannot stay for too long. Five moves have been completed, and my opponent has a small advantage of 0.22, but until now we've played completely book moves, so 0.22 doesn't mean too much. Next move. My opponent places a knight on f3 to develop it, and I also develop my own knight on f6. And now my opponent places the bishop on c4 and attacks my queen on d5. Of course, I cannot take the bishop because the knight on d2 will take my queen. Where can I place my queen? Not too many squares. f5, h5, or d67, d8. Most of the squares I was afraid of follow-ups attacks to my queen until my queen either would have nowhere to go or I would have to lose something else to save my queen. That's why I played it safe. Queen goes all the way back to d8, even though the computer would prefer h5. Until now, we had book moves, and this is the first move. You see here until now book moves. The first move that is not a book move. And now both of us castle. My opponent plays knight on b3 to attack my bishop on c5. And since I love this wonderful diagonal, it goes from h7 to g1, and I want to keep my bishop, I send it back to b6. My opponent decides to pin my knight, my f6 knight, sending the bishop to g5. Pins by themselves are not scaring if you know what's going to happen, and if you can be very confident on your defense. But for people at my level, pins are scary. You don't like them unless. And I didn't see the unless, and that's why I wanted to unpin my knight. But how? If I move my queen to, let's say, c7 or e8, my opponent will take the knight on f6. I take back with the pawn, and the g file is open, and my opponent can start attacking, and soon it's going to be over. So I have to prepare the pinning with my knight to d7. So next move, my queen can leave it because my opponent takes on f6, can leave d8, I mean, because my opponent can take on f6, my knight to take back. We completed the first 10 moves. What is the score? My opponent is leading by 0.37. That means really not too much at all. Among very strong players, it means most likely a draw. Among people of our level, it means who will do the fewest mistakes and who will avoid the blunders. My opponent places the rook on e1. Control of the semi-open file. Semi-open because there's only a black pawn on e6 and no white pawns. And my queen goes to c7. Not only I unpin the knight on f6, I also attack the bishop on c4. So my opponent needs to save the bishop in the next move, one way or the other. And the opponent does it by sending the bishop to d3. My knight from f6 goes to d5. Now my knight is not pinned any longer. I wanted to put in a nice place in the center, even though the computer says it's inaccuracy. And before doing so, I was thinking about the Greek gift possibility. Greek gift means when knight goes to h7, and after the king takes back when bishop goes to h7 with a check, and when king takes back, because otherwise you're down a pawn, knight goes to g5 check, and then queen goes to h5. It's called the Greek gift. I'm not sure if it is because of the Homeric epics where the Greeks offered the Trojans the wooden horse, and after the Trojans accepted it, the Greeks captured the city, or it is after the Italian player Greco. Doesn't matter. But for the time being, that's not possible because of the bishop of g5. And my opponent, I'm not sure if that's what they had in mind, to make it possible, send the bishop to h4. But whether they thought of it or not, I knew now the Greek gift was a possibility. And your Greek player wants to deprive the opponent of the Greek gift, and I do it by sending my pawn to h6. If my opponent wants now to check with bishop to h7, you're very welcome, because after my king takes back, if they want to check with the knight, I don't have to put my king either to g6 or g8, but I can take the pawn. No Greek gift for my non-Greek opponent. My opponent decides to do something else, threaten my queen. I'm not sure if that's what they had in mind before moving the bishop to h4 to threaten the queen. But this was too obvious, and I saved the queen, sending it to d8. When I played that, I was thinking, is my opponent try for a threefold repetition? Because if they place the bishop on h4, one possibility would be to put my queen to c7 and then go back and forth. Not too many other possibilities. I don't want to weaken myself. For example, pawn to f6 means I lose the e6 pawn to the rook. Pawn to g5 means I weaken the defense in front of my king. Perhaps queen to e8, I don't know what. But my opponent didn't let me worry about that because they sent the rook to c1. My knight from d7 goes to f6. You may think similar story like before. Not exactly. I have more space because before I had knight d7 f6, now I have d5 f6. My opponent decides to push. Now we finish, first of all, the first 15 moves, and my opponent has an advantage of 0.74, little by little growing. My opponent decides to place a pawn on a3. I'm not sure what exactly. Was they afraid of me placing my knight on b4? I didn't even have this in my mind. I want to develop my last pieces. Until now, rook a8, bishop c8 is undeveloped. Queen, yes, I know it has moved from d8 but came back. But let's put the bishop on c7, from d7, hopefully to place it on c6 and control the long diagonal from a8 to h1. My opponent decides to attack my knight by sending the pawn to c4. When I saw it, I felt is a one-move threat, easy to detect, and weakens the bishop on d3 and weakens the squares at d3 and d4. So I wasn't feeling that bad about it. But then I thought, where to put my knights? Okay, I said I'm going to place my knight somewhere, and that's it. And I have later it might use it for advance. But then the question is, where the somewhere? I saw a knight even at the center, has only 8 squares to go. 2 of them are occupied by my bishop on b6 and my knight on f6. The 4 that could be forward squares, b4, c3, e3. Let's do them again. b4, c3. Why can't they move? b4, c3, e3. I do them one by one. b4, c3, e3, and f4. My knight is lost. So what squares remain? Only c7 and e7. c7, what's going to happen is pawn goes to c5. Let's do it again. c7, pawn goes to c5. And then my bishop is lost. It can only move to, if I take the pawn, of course, the rook will take it. If they go to a5, the knight will take it. And that is why by elimination, I found that I only had one square of my knight on e7. I hate it. The computer will say it's a great move, but I hate it when I choose a move not because of what the move itself is doing, but because every other move is a disaster. Let's continue. Now my opponent still has the same plan, pawn to c5, but now my bishop has the retreat square of c7, that if I had placed my knight there, my bishop would not have it. And now my opponent decides to do something I didn't feel was good for them. Exchange on c7. My opponent is pushing pawns and pieces ahead, is attacking, and when you attack and you constrain your opponent, you don't want to exchange pieces. You want to uh, play, although both sides get the same material, you want your opponent to have as little space as possible to place their pieces. But instead, by exchanging on c7, I loved it. One less thing to worry about, not having to worry about the dark-colored bishops. Now my opponent continues the attack, knight goes to d4, good move, the best move. And I'm afraid of my opponent placing either bishop or a knight on b5, and especially a knight would attack my queen, the bishop perhaps of an exchange, the knight would be then attack my queen. I don't want these things even to be as a possibility. Pawn goes to a6. We completed the first 20 moves, and you see that my opponent has an advantage of 0.43 after the first 20 moves. But let's see what will happen later. Still, there is a long way to go. My opponent places the knight on e5 and threatens my bishop on d7. My queen, of course, cannot take the knight because the rook will take the queen. I don't like the knight on e5. It's on my half of the board. I want to eliminate it, and that's why I'm sending my knight to c6. My opponent decides, since usually a bishop is more valuable than a knight, let's exchange. I don't think it's a good decision, and I'll explain why. Because my bishop is called what's called a bad bishop, blocked by its own pieces and pawns. While the knight on e5, it has a very nice place. Yes, can be removed by this knight here. In fact, attacked twice by my knight and queen, defended only once. Maybe a knight to f3 would have been a better choice. But that's why when I felt some relief when my opponent took on d7, and how will I take back? I have two ways, either with the queen on c7 or the knight on f6. I decided with the queen, because now I'm also attacking the knight on d4. And in case you wonder, if my queen takes it, the bishop cannot go to h7 for a check, because my queen on d4 will be protected by my knight on h6, and they are not going to win a queen for a piece. If anything, they're going to lose a piece. My opponent says this thing and decides to continue exchanges, takes the knight on c6. I felt relief, one more piece removed, and now how to take back. Uh, if there are two ways to take it back, you see, either with a queen or with a pawn. If I take with a pawn, look what's happening. I'm creating isolated pawn on c6, and I didn't like it at all. Pawn that cannot be protected by the pawn on b or d file. I have 3 pawn islands versus 2 of my opponent, and that's why, even though the computer doesn't like it, I decided to take with the queen. And also, look towards g2, the square g2. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy, but I still don't regret it. Queen to e2 for my opponent. And I decide to take control of the open D file. It's the only open file on the board from D8 to D1, no pawns there, and rooks love them. C and E files are semi-open because there are pawns of only one color, and the others are closed. And my opponent decides to contest it. Rook goes to D1, and my rook goes to D5, and I'm threatening the pawn on C5, attacking twice by queen and rook, defended only once by the rook on C1. There are more than one ways for my opponent to defend it, but we completed 25 moves. What is the score? 0.48. My opponent is ahead. Still a small advantage, doesn't mean too much. But of course, better have it than your opponent having it. My opponent decides to create what's called a pawn chain that goes from A3 to C5 by pushing the pawn to B4. And I increased my control of the D file, sending my other rook to D8. My opponent sends the bishop to C2. And at this point, I want my queen to pressure on H2, and if I can place my knight on G4, it's very strong pressure. So I press my queen to C7, also provide extra protection for my rook at D8. Bishop goes to B3 and threatens my rook on D5. And of course, I don't want to lose the rook for a bishop, even though it's quite a nice bishop on B3. So let's start exchanging. One round of exchange, and of course, my opponent will take it. Definitely not with the queen, because then they lose the queen. With the rook. Second round exchange, okay, to the queen, and now the queen on D1, believe it or not, now white controls the open D file with the queen from D1 to D8. And I want to centralize my queen, goes to E5, and white would have a back rank issue. Back rank is when the king is blocked by its own pawns, but for the time being, the queen on the first rank stops it. But my opponent would be constrained. Be very careful where to move the queen. If it is not a check, then better make sure that my next move will not be a back rank checkmate. We completed the first 30 moves, and my opponent's ahead by 0.37. There's a long, long way to go until the end. My opponent decides to do something very, very sneaky. Bishop to C2. What does this mean? If my opponent could play again, second move in a row, it's checkmate in two moves. Queen D8 check, knight E8, queen E8 mate. Why? Because although my king does not suffer directly from a back rank because the H pawn has moved, this happened when I wanted to stop the Greek gift ideas. However, with the bishop on C2, the H7 square is controlled. And it's too easy to disregard this kind of threats until it's too late. But fortunately, unlike the first round where I got the caught in one move I did not see, this time I saw it on tie. And I placed my pawn to G6, and there is no checkmate. Computer thinks the best, and now I'm down to 0, 0, 0 from being always, in fact, not I'm down, I'm equalizing. And my opponent decides to push the pawn to A4. I'm not sure why. They had a wonderful pawn chain. Maybe they wanted to do an attack, a majority attack on the queen side, and eventually create a pass pawn. I thought of it. In any case, I didn't like it, and I placed my queen to C3. I'm attacking the pawn on B4. Inaccuracy the computer, but I felt happy when I did it. I'm attacking A1 and E1 squares if the queen leaves the first rank. Also, if the queen goes to F1, for example, I'm winning the bishop. A1, E1, of course, I win the queen. I thought I had a wonderful position for my queen. I'm doing a lot of great things together. My opponent places the queen on B1, and perhaps was dreaming to the best is a computer, perhaps was dreaming bishop takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen takes here, and they may have at least a perpetual. If not winning quite a lot of pawns there that justify the loss of the bishop. I don't want anything like that to happen. King goes to G7. Pawn goes to g3 for my opponent finally get rid of the back rank issue. My knight goes to d5, and I'm threatening the pawn at b4. It's attacked twice by queen and knight, defended by the queen, and there's no other way it can be defended. There's no pawn to defend it. The bishop is light colored, cannot go defend it here, even though if the bishop could magically fly in any light colored pawn it wanted. The king is too far away, fg8 pawns cannot do it, so the b4 pawn is lost. If the pawn moves straight forward, then the c5 pawn is lost. And my opponent, after lots of thought, found the only move that would, of course, not save the pawn, it's beyond salvation, but at least would give them a pawn back. Bishop to e4, because once my knight goes there, they take the b7 pawn. Whether it goes there immediately or after queen exchange. And now what do I do? I can take the b4 pawn. I have to take it either with the queen or the knight. And not only that, I had seen that yes, the pawn, the bishop could take on b7. But then they could lose the c5 pawn. But this would happen only if I took on b4 with a knight and did not exchange queens. Also, if I exchange queens with a knight versus a bishop, even with an extra pawn, I wasn't very confident if I could handle it correctly. That's why knight takes first on, in fact, if we exchange queens, I wouldn't even win the extra pawn. So what I did is I won the pawn with my knight. We completed 35 moves and now I'm ahead by 0.36. You may wonder, it's too little. Yes, but now I'm ahead. But can I keep it like that? My opponent takes the opponent b7. That was their idea. Yes, I win b4. They win b7. That's what, I'm not sure if they saw it or not, but what I had seen is then I take the pawn on c5. And my opponent cannot take the a6 pawn because of my knight on b4. So I'm a pawn ahead, but what kind of pawn? On the queen side, the a pawns cancel each other, and on the king side, it is 4 versus 3 for me. Yes, it's nice to have it, but if queens, knight, bishop would disappear, I'm not sure if I could win this thing with just because of the extra pawn on e6. So the game continues. My opponent realizes that things may not look so nice for them, so let's do some checks, see if we can get the repetition. Who knows what? King goes to g8. Queen goes to d2, going for the h6 pawn. My knight goes to a5. And computer thinks it's the best. My pawn places the bishop on e4. My king goes to g7, supporting the pawn on h6. The queen checks from b2. King goes to g8. My opponent may think that they have a repetition. Queen goes to d2, and my queen goes to e5. They want to win the h6 pawn. Wonderful, I'm winning the bishop. That's what happened after the first 40 moves. I'm ahead by 0.89. My advantage becomes a little bit bigger, but still not decisive yet. Bishop goes to g2. My opponent wants to safeguard their bishop. My king goes to g7. That don't want any h6 ideas. My opponent to win the a6 pawn. Bishop goes to f1. But now that the bishop goes to f1, I'm pinning the bishop. My queen goes to a1. threatening the pawn on a4. The bishop cannot move from f1, for example, to go to b5. So my opponent plays the only move that can save the pawn, because if this pawn is lost, I have an outside pass pawn. The a5 becomes very dangerous. So my goal is not to count on my 4 versus 3 majority on the king side, but to eliminate the a pawn on the queen side. My opponent's a pawn, I have my a pawn, move and promote. That was my idea from now on. But will it become a reality? Let's see. Queen goes to d7, protects the pawn. My knight goes to d5. Queen goes to b5. Not only protects it, but is near winning my pawn, and now my opponent will have the outside pass pawn. And my queen goes to e1 to protect it, and I'm still keeping the bishop at f1 pinned. We completed 45 moves, and the computer says my advantage becomes larger, 1.59. My opponent unpins the bishop by sending the king to g2. My queen goes to d2, and I'm threatening if I could play again, my knight would go to e3 with a check. And then I'm exchanging with the bishop, and then I have very good chances to win the pawn or constrain my opponent very much. Still not winning, but it was quite a threat, because not only it is a check, it is a pin. It is a fork. I'm also attacking the bishop on f1. So my opponent decides to deprive me of this idea. King goes to g1. My knight goes to c3, and simultaneously commits a mistake. Now I'm attacking the queen, also attacking the a4 pawn, and my opponent cannot take the pawn on a5, because if they do so, my knight goes to e2 check, discover, and they win the queen. But my opponent did not fold that, and instead they send the queen to c6. So my queen needs to stay there to support my knight. Computer thinks a miss. The better move was queen to e5, and who knows, they might even have a perpetual. The queen goes to c1, pins the bishop, and threatens knight goes to e2 with a check, and I win the queen. King goes to g2, stops my idea. My queen goes to e3, ready to win the pawn at a4. I attack it twice with queen and knight. Defending currently only once with the queen on c6, but since a light colored pawn, the bishop can still defend it. Bishop goes to b5 as expected. And now, should I exchange on the b5 with my knight or not? There are two options, and unfortunately, if this pawn could go to b5, it's much near promotion than my pawn, and it promotes first. That's why I decided not to do so. Instead, I send my queen to b4. We completed the first 50 moves. I am ahead by 1.91. Whether this can lead to a win or not, first of all I need is one blunder or a few big mistakes, and it can change very fast. And with queens on the board, things can happen very easily. Plus, my opponent perhaps could have a perpetual, at least get a draw. But let's see what happened next. My opponent takes the queen where to place it. And decides to place it after thinking about c7, now other squares, finally lets it rest on c4. And this, the computer thinks a blunder. My advantage becomes 4.44. When I saw this, I knew this was my chance. What I'm going to do now is first exchange the queens. And then the most important is not the queens that are exchanged, because with knight versus bishop, even the extra pawn would not give me the win. But now I win the pawn on a4. And finally, have the passed pawn on a5, the outside passed pawn. My opponent realizes the only hope is activate the king goes to f3. My knight will go to b2 because I want to give space to my pawn to go to a4 and a3 at least. a2 I'll have to fight again, but at least until a3 I was safe. Bishop goes to a2 to block my pawn. And my pawn goes to e4. Starts going towards promotion. 3 more squares to go. King goes to e4. King wants to come near as possible to see if they can take the pawn. If the king can take the pawn. But my knight goes to d1. Basically, my knight is saying, look, king, if you want to continue the way forward to take my pawn, I'm winning the f-pawn, and my knight will be near to win at least one of the other 2 pawns. And yes, you stop the a-pawn, but I can win the game with my pawns on the king side. We finished first 55 moves, and I'm ahead by 577. I started seeing the victory is very, very near, but I still need to be careful. If I lose the a4 pawn without winning any of the FGH pawns, things can turn around very suddenly. King goes back to f3 to protect the f2 pawn. My king starts activating, go to f6. Bishop goes to c4. And my king goes to e5. Now I'm going to activate my king, and the king on f3 cannot leave f3 without endangering the FGH pawns. Mine, can my pawns be lost if I'm not careful? Yes, because 3 out of the 4 are in light squares. Only the h6, and I cannot start moving them without placing any danger, but this was my last hope. First, let's see if we can promote the a pawn. King goes to e2 for my opponent. My knight goes to b2 and threatens the bishop on c4. Bishop goes again to a2 to block my pawn. My king now goes to d4. King to d2 because now my knight is not threatening the f2 any longer. My knight goes to d3 and threatens the f2 pawn. Completed the first 60 moves, and I'm ahead by 7.00. This is quite significant, and I can see the victory coming. But still, I need to be careful because if I accidentally lose my knight, and my opponent grabs the a-pawn, things can turn around very suddenly. So my opponent decided to push the pawn to f3, so at least they don't lose the f-pawn. And my knight goes to b4. What's happening now is that the bishop has to move, and where can it move? It can only move safely to b1. Then I'm going to push the pawn to a3. The king cannot easily come near because c3 and c2 are blocking, perhaps can go to here. Then I attack the pawn. Bishop has to go, who knows where, I doubt it can go safely anywhere, perhaps to c2, and then I promote the pawn if they don't want to lose. Otherwise, they would lose they would win the pawn but lose the knight. And then with the knight and 4 pawns versus 3, I think I could win it. That's why after move 61, my opponent resigned after a difficult game. Let's do the review and see how things went. What does the computer think about the games? Let's wait and yes, finally it finished. 84.8 accuracy for my opponent, 89.3 for me, almost 90%. And my opponent played as if their rating was 2250, I would say double their real rating. And I played as if it was 2400 international master at least. The various categories: no brilliancies, 1 great move each of us, book 7 versus 6 for my opponent, best 27 versus 14 for me, excellent 14 versus 10 for my opponent, good 10 versus 3 for my opponent, 10 inaccuracies each of us, mistakes 4 for my opponent, 2 for me, and 1 miss each of us. A team went on to get a 2 versus 2 draw against the other team, and my win, this means that spared a team from losing. And they started the first day with 1 loss and 1 win. In next videos, we're going to tell you what happened in the next rounds. Round number 3 took place this morning. We're going to tell you what happened there. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Thanks to all the viewers, the subscribers. Thanks to the likes and the comments. I'm Harry Roseniziris. This is the grecochess YouTube channel. Goodbye.